你好，我叫 Andy，我是电脑小猫，我是美国人，但我的妻子是中国人。我很高兴在这里。什么？听不懂？Don't understand what I'm saying? Sorry, let's try that again. Hello, everyone. My name is Andy Knight, and I'm the Automation Panda. I'm so glad to be here today. I am a software engineer and test by trade. Currently, I am a developer advocate at Applitools, and I also know a little bit of Chinese, as I shared. So just a little bit about my background. As I said, I'm a developer advocate at Applitools, where we focus on automated visual testing. You make a web app, you want to make sure it looks good, looks right. If you have changes along the way in your visuals, they can break. We have tools to help you for that. I also help lead Test Automation University, which is one of the best online platforms for learning about testing and automation. All courses are free, best instructors in the world. Definitely check it out. So you might be wondering why I opened in Chinese. Well, that's a little bit frustrating when you can't understand, when somebody's speaking to you in a different language, or in the context of web development, when you have a web app load that's in a different language, right? It's inaccessible to you. So what we're going to talk about today is how to translate between languages in a Django application. So let me get the story here. Why Chinese? So my family is actually from China. I'm good old American boy. I'm from Baltimore. I currently live in North Carolina, but my wife is from Shandong province in China. That's where her family was from. We met, a decade ago. We now live together happily in North Carolina. But so we are a bicultural family. My wife and I live together with our little puppy Suki, and her mom lives right down the road. So the main spoken language in our households is not English or Chinese, it's actually Chinglish. we kind of smash the two together. So how does this all come into web apps and translations? Well, once upon a time, a couple of years ago, my wife Jessica and her mom actually ran a small export business where we would buy things here in the US and then export them to China. We would sell them online. We would sell them on Taobao, which is kind of like Amazon meets eBay in China, owned by Alibaba. And so it first started small. We were selling things like shoes and cosmetics, nothing big. But it was very popular because folks in China really liked Western goods, especially name brand kinds of things. I can't tell you how many Nike flip-flops we sold. Crazy, right? But as this business grew, it was a small operation, but as it grew, my wife and her mom needed an order management process. They needed a way to keep track of what they were buying, who they were selling to, what the address was, what the amounts were, and all that kind of stuff. And so I thought to myself, hey, wait, this is a software problem. At first, they were using spreadsheets, and the spreadsheets were getting really bad. Pro tip, if you ever need a new business proposal or idea, find where people are abusing spreadsheets and substitute that with a web application. You can easily make a startup out of that. And so basically that's what it is. Like, hey, you're trying to automate your process here. Let me make a web app for tracking your orders. And so I built one using Django. Why? Because Django is awesome. I had learned a little bit of Python before. I saw how easy it was to learn how to use the Django framework. The documentation was really good. It was server side, so it was safe. And also with Django, it's batteries included. You have a lot of really cool features out of the box. So I basically used the admin forms. So I didn't even really make a true front end. I just used the admin site features to build them visuals that would help them, create objects for their orders and their products, and then track that through status and workflows and stuff. Where I hosted this whole Django app for them on Heroku, Heroku platform as a service. Basically, all you have to do, again, this is super simple. You basically push your project up to Heroku with like a git push, and then it's just there. right? It runs, and on the lowest tier of service, it's free on Heroku. And so since we were small time, like we didn't need fast uptime. We were only logging in once or twice a day. The free tier was good enough for our needs. Also, a pretty cool thing we did, we hooked in Amazon S3 for hosting things like our image files. Like we would upload images of products and stuff. And so that would just be so that my wife would know what was, what went with what order. And we would just put that in an S3 bucket and pipe that in. So really, really small thing, but really cool that we can use these free and open source tools or free tier tools and just smash things together and make something that saved hours and hours of time a week. There's only one problem though. I only speak English. I speak a little Chinese, not much. My wife is bilingual, English and Mandarin. But Mama, who was also helping with this little endeavor, at the time only spoke Mandarin Chinese. She did not speak English. Now she's taken English classes and she's learned a little bit more, and I've also learned a little more Chinese. So we truly are each English family. But in terms of like business process and operations, our language skills were not there. So we needed a way to translate the entire application between English and Mandarin Chinese. That way I could log in and see everything just fine, or Mama could log in and see everything just fine in Chinese for her needs. And so this is what the application looked like that we made. Don't worry, there's no private information here being shared. But this is a screenshot of the site hosted in Heroku. If you know the Django admin forms, this should look very familiar. It's just all the characters in Chinese. And if you notice in the upper right corner, excuse me, where I have like the login, log out profile buttons, you'll see two flags. You'll see an American flag and a Chinese flag. And so if you want to switch the language, you click those two little buttons and it flips the whole page between English or Chinese characters. And so, yeah, we could come in here, we could filter, we could open new orders, create new orders, move them through a process. We have little actions for things like calculate totals and all. Everything that the Django admin provided, or everything that we needed, was provided by the Django admin. So how did we do this? Let's look at how to actually make these translations happen in a Django project. There's essentially 4 steps to translations. First, you need to add some app settings to enable translations. Second, you need to add proper routing for pages for the translations. Third, and this is the big one, you need to go through all of your text and mark all the strings that appear visibly for translation. And fourth and finally, mostly a workflow thing, you need to compile your language files so that Django knows exactly what the mappings of words to words are. I'm going to walk you through all these steps today. If you want to learn more or you want to have a good reference for later, the Django documentation is honestly the best place to go. They have a very thorough guide. How I learned was basically I went to the docs, read up on it, and did it myself. So as part of this workflow, there are a few key terms that I want us to use carefully, because that will help us understand what we mean when we say a token or a string or a translation versus internationalization. So when I say the word token or when I say the word string, what I'm referring to is a string of text that can be translated. These strings or tokens will be located throughout your application code and also in your templates. Basically, any string or token that appears publicly on your site is something that you will want to translate. A translation, if we're being careful, is a mapping of strings or tokens from one language to another. So if I have the word hello in English as a string, that would translate to ni hao in Mandarin Chinese. Hello, ni hao. And so what we have is in the text, the translation is essentially a mapping of the string or token, those characters, hello, to the string or token characters in Chinese for ni hao. Localization is the process of adapting an app for a locale. Sometimes you may see localization abbreviated as L10N, 10 characters. So a translation is just the mapping. Localization is more of a process. When we have an application, we would say, hey, I'm going to do localization, or I'm going to localize this app for mainland China. The locale would be mainland China, and the locale includes not just language, but also cultural considerations. So things like, not only do I need to say ni hao instead of hello, but I need to use simplified Chinese characters for mainland China versus traditional Chinese characters for Hong Kong, Taiwan, or Singapore. And I have to handle things like date and time format, right? In the US, we usually go month, day, year. The rest of the world is day, month, year. So those kinds of formatting change, or things like dollars versus Chinese yuan. All those kinds of considerations are part of locale, whereas translation is purely a word-to-word or string-to-string mapping for translation. It's another $2 word here, internationalization, or I-18N. So whereas localization is when we talk about adapting an app for a locale, the internationalization is the development work and tools that enable localization, right? Localization is kind of like the output, the product, that you have localized your app. But internationalization is more of the meta level, the abstract level. It's things like, it includes things like all the Django tools that enable localization and translation. It's the process of doing it not just maybe for mainland China, maybe for Hong Kong, or maybe for Taiwan or other places and countries. So these are the terms that we will be throwing around. A lot of time, localization, internationalization, and even translation are treated synonymously, but there is a little bit of distinction here to be aware of. So let's do this. Let's translate an app. Step 1, settings. What we're going to do is we're going to put all of these settings in our Django settings file. First thing we want to do is add the locale middleware to our list of middlewares. We need to be careful. We need to put this between our session middleware and our common middleware. Reason why we need to do this is the locale middleware, first of all, uses sessions. So session middleware has to come first. And the common middleware has to come after because it uses URL prefixes that the locale middleware inserts. Now, what locale middleware does for us is it helps with that routing and stuff. So when you load a page in your Django app, locale middleware checks for your language preference in a specific order. And based on that, if it can find your language preference, it will try to render your page in that appropriate translation, in that appropriate localization, I should say. So first, what it looks for is if there is a URL language prefix in your full URL. Things like, do you have EN or ZH? We'll see that in a little bit. URL prefix is preeminent. If it has that, boom, that's the language you're using. Second thing it'll look for is if you have a language cookie in your request to indicate what language you want. And that will be provided by the language cookie name variable. Third thing it will look for is if you have an accept language HTTP header, right? Is the request expecting something in terms of an accept language? And then finally, if all else fails, it'll fall back on the default language, which is set by the language code variable in the settings file optionally. So more settings. First of all, like I just said, that language code setting, this will be your default language. Highly recommend you add this to your settings. Usually it's going to be like if you're in America, you're going to be English, but you can change this because you might not be in America. You might be working in China, you might be in Mexico, you might be in Europe, right? So I always recommend you set your language code appropriately. For my app, because I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, I'm going to set EN, specifically the US locale. Also, we need to enable internationalization and localization. So there are these two additional settings, use I18N and use L10N, and we want to explicitly set them to true. I18N is what enables translations to happen. L10N is what enables the formatting of dates and numbers to the specified locale. Small little thing, if you're not doing any internationalization or localization, you can set these to false to get a very, very small performance boost in Django. It just kind of skips that step. It's not really significant, but just you could turn it off. Finally, we also need to specify the languages for translation. Now, this again is optional, but highly recommended. What you do is you provide a list of tuples. The tuples are the locale that you're going to use, as well as the name of that locale. So here in my app, I had two languages. I had English and I had simplified Chinese or Mandarin. If you don't provide this list, what can happen is that when somebody comes to your app and they explicitly want to do a language that your app doesn't support, the app will try to do it and kind of silently fail, or it'll redirect or something. I forget exactly what it does. So if I explicitly try to put in French into my URL prefix, it would go through and it wouldn't show French. And you'd be like, what the heck? This is wrong. If you explicitly do set a list of languages like this, if I try to do French, it'll stop me and say, no, this is not supported. You can't do this. So it's explicit rather than implicit. Oh, shoot, I forgot. There is one more setting you have here. So your locales will be, or all your translations will be stored in a locale directory, and that'll be in your project. And so you need to tell Django where to get all those locale files. There's a couple ways you can do it. You can set locales per folder, per application in your Django project, or you can set like universal locations. I personally like to put all of my locales for my entire Django project just in one locale directory. You can split it out by app, and the nice thing is, like, if you've got an app that you want to reuse somewhere else, you can kind of bundle up the locale just for the pieces that thing needs. But if your app is small enough, like mine was, just put it all in one place and have done with it. So you specify the locale paths setting, and then I just create a directory called locale and put it all in there. If you don't specify this, Django looks for directories named locale in each of your applications. So settings done. That wasn't too hard. That was literally just kind of put config in place and boom, done. Declare it once, you're finished. Now let's look at how to set URL prefixes. And again, this one isn't too bad. Ideally, what we want to have is we want to be able to specify a locale prefix in our URL so that if I say, hey, I want myapp.com/en, that's going to give me a page in English, right? Whereas if I say, I want my app to be ZH Hans, I want that specifies Mandarin Chinese, simplified characters. That way, it's really convenient because you can separately bookmark things for different pages, or if somebody wants to easily switch, you can link one to the other. That's really good. Also, if we do not provide a URL prefix, then it should fall back on our default language or any one of those other criteria that we saw for how locale middleware figures out what language to use. So in this case, if I did not provide a language prefix, I would want that to default to US English. Setting this up isn't so bad. So typically what we do is we have our Django URLs in like a urls.py file. Essentially, we are going to wrap our list of URLs, right? And wrapping it is going to insert the appropriate language prefix that we want. So we used from Django conf URLs internationalization import I18N patterns. Then you would still specify your Django URLs paths like you normally would. You're just going to wrap them in this I18N patterns call. Furthermore, if we want to use that default language when there's no prefix given, we're going to add the additional keyword argument prefix default language and set that to false. That will make sure that we can still go to use the default language if no prefix is provided. And the nice thing about this is this will just add that language prefix to all your URLs, right? You don't need to think twice. You don't need to add any special logic. The framework does this for you. It's beautiful. So now here comes the beastly part, the strings. This is the most tedious and most time-consuming part of this whole localization exercise. As I said before, every single visible string on the front end of your application needs a translation, or rather needs to be marked for translation. So you will need to go through your code and mark every single string for translation. So here is an example of doing that in a view. So what you do is you say from Django utils translation import get text. Get text is the magic function that will translate your strings or tokens. It's also very common to import it with the alias of a single underscore character. Why? Because you're literally going to be populating your entire code base with this thing. So one character is nice, and the underscore is unintrusive. So here we go. Let's say we have a view that returns an output saying, welcome to my site. What you're going to do is you're going to take that string and just wrap it in the get text call. So you can see it here, underscore parenthesis, welcome to my site. What that'll do is that'll call the get text function, pop in that string, and then the translation that we will provide later will be given instead of the English string here. Now, as a practice, you can actually define your strings in two ways. What I did in my site is I wrote all of the strings and tokens in my code base, in my Python modules, and in my templates in English, and then just wrap them up. What another alternative would be, instead of popping the English in here, to give it some sort of token name, like basically like an identifier name, like a variable name, and use that as the string throughout your entire code base. And then instead of having your defined language being English and then your translation language being something else like Mandarin Chinese, you would actually have an English translation for those tokens. Pros and cons of each. I don't know. I mean, it's either way you look at it. I think it's a little easier to put it in one language and have it translate to another rather than have all these identifier strings running around. That's just me. You have one translation to do instead of two. So that's how we mark our strings for translation. However, the get text function actually has some limitations. If you use get text, it performs the translation immediately, right? As soon as that command is evaluated in the Python execution, boom, it's going to pop it in there. That's not always ideal because you may need to translate strings that are in things like Django models, which don't always have which would be loaded before translations are ready. And so what is a preferred way of doing it is to do lazy translation with the get text underscore lazy function instead of the get text function. So in this example here, we have a model and I want to translate all those names. You can see them underlined in red here. All these are using the lazy get text function so that it will be evaluated and translated when it is called, not when it is first loaded or first executed or defined, I should say, for the case of a class here. So what I recommend as a best practice, or I should say a recommended practice, I just use get text lazy everywhere. I've had it where I use get text in certain places, but then I would put in the localization, run the app, and then see, hey, these things aren't translated. What the heck is wrong? Oh, let me try a get lazy, pop in a get lazy or get text lazy, and it worked. So I've never had a case where a get text lazy did not work for me. So I just use get text lazy everywhere. There's probably like a small execution performance hit or something because of the lazy evaluation. I've never really had an issue with it. So take that for what you will. Just note that if you're doing things in classes or models especially, you'll want to use the get text lazy translation. You can also do translations in templates as well as Python code. You use the trans directive, and what that'll do is essentially just like a get text function. You can translate string literals as well as variables, which is pretty useful. If you are if you're still doing translation as a work in progress, you can actually no op your templates. So here you can say no op at the end, and it will ignore translation. And then you can come back later, remove those, and it'll do it for you. If you have a larger block of text that you need to translate, not just like a word or a sentence or a phrase, you can use the block trans directive. And so that way you have, kind of before and after, like open and close, start and end. And then you just put all the text in there. And you can even do interpolation with values, which is pretty cool, as you can see here with the curly braces popping in a particular variable. On top of that, you can translate the admin site. This was crucial to my needs. And this is actually one thing that, at least when I was originally developing this app, that the Django docs didn't really cover. They just kind of mentioned. So I had to figure out how to do this myself. So if you want to translate your admin site, I can offer a little bit of advice. First piece of advice for the admin: use lazy translation for all strings. Why? Because it deals a lot with models and stuff and the views it generates. Don't wreck yourself. Just use lazy. It's okay. Second thing to note is that the admin templates already have translations for many, many languages. So you don't need to translate the things that the admin already gives you. Primarily, the things you're going to be translating will be names in your models. When I learned this, it blew my mind. It was awesome. I took a look at the list of the languages and stuff. I mean, it had like 80, 90 at the time or something. It was huge. I think it was that number. And I remember seeing some of the Django release notes saying, oh, we added like Ukrainian, we added Turkic, we added this. It's like, they just kept adding more. It was incredible. So you may think it's going to be a lot of work to translate the admin. It's actually not as bad as you might think. When you provide translations for your apps and your models, provide translations for verbose name, not name. I learned this the hard way. I tried to translate name. It didn't appear. What the heck's going on? Translate verbose name, and then it appears. Also, make sure to provide translations for your titles. These three things here: admin site index title, site header, and site title. That just polishes the whole thing. Again, I forgot those, and I took a long time wondering, how do I get these to do? Here you go. You don't have to plunge to the docs like I did. If you want to learn more about translating Django admins, specifically translating the admin, I wrote a whole blog article on it at automationpanda.com. So take a snapshot, copy this link, go there afterwards, or you could probably Google Automation Panda Django app admin translations, and you'll find it. So let's compile these things. Fourth and final step: you've put your settings in place. You've updated your URL prefixes. You've marked every single string throughout your code base for translation. Now it's time to actually do the translation step. And we call that compilation. So first thing we need to do is we need to make what are called message files. Django has the tools for this in the admin, or the Django manage script. Python, manage py, make messages. What this will do is it'll scan your whole code base and look for all those strings. And then when it finds them, it'll generate a message file with that translation, string A to string B mapping. When you call make messages, you need to provide the locale. And so for Mandarin Chinese, simplified characters, the code is ZH _ capital HANS. You might be wondering, how the heck did this happen? Well, let me explain. So like English, EN makes sense, ENUS, but Chinese, ZH? Well, in English, we call the name of the country China, and we call the language Chinese. In Mandarin Chinese, The name of China is Zhongguo, and the name of the Chinese language is Zhongwen. Well, at least for most of it. There's nuance there, but just go Zhongguo and Zhongwen. When we romanize those Chinese characters, Zhong means middle, that high sound. We spell it in Latin characters as ZHONG. Zhong. ZH in pinyin characters is the j sound. So Zhongguo, ZH. Now you might be wondering what's Han's versus, or so yeah, the HAN, Han Dynasty, Han China, Han script, that's the name of the characters, the Han script. And the S is for simplified versus Han T, which would be traditional. In mainland China, they use simplified characters. Why? History. Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, they still use traditional characters, which are more complicated. Completely different character set, similar but different. It's kind of like, we don't have a good analogy in English. Imagine like reading calligraphy versus printed characters or something. That's the closest we can get, but they are like truly different characters. So anyway, you specify the locales that you want, and it will generate language files for those. Searches the whole code base for all translatable strings. And if you don't have any language files already under your locale paths from your settings, it will create a new language file. If you already have language files, it doesn't blast them away. It will add, or it will append the new strings to translate to the end of the existing files, which is really nice. Also, there's something very careful I want you to note here, and that's the distinction between locale name and language code. I've kind of used them interchangeably, most people do, but there is a difference between locale name and language code. So if you noticed in the URL prefixes, we had lowercase zh hyphen lowercase HANS. Whereas here we're using the locale name, which is ZH underscore capital HANS. Why is there a different format? I don't really know. Somebody somewhere, it's not a Django thing. It's a international localization thing. But the language code is what we would think of as like, you know, what we put in the settings and what we put in our accept headers and what we would put in our URLs. But here we need a locale code, which is different. I spent a couple hours one time with this trying to make my messages and it wasn't working. I'm like, what the heck is it? And I realized it was the difference between locale name and language code. You can look these up on Wikipedia. They're standard, they're international, all that stuff. Just make sure here you're using locale name, not language code. So once we make those messages, that will create PO files for each locale that we have specified. And this is what that language or that messages file, that language file looks like. It's basically a mapping. Like I said, translation is mapping of string to string. So you will see in a comment line exactly where in your code base that string appears. You will have the message ID, which is the original string. So for me, that's English, right? It could be like another token name or whatever. And then you'll have the message string. When you first generate this, the message string will be blank. It'll be empty. And so what you need to do is you need to go in and provide the translation for that message ID. So here you can see like name was translated to Mingzi, which is Chinese for name. Now, Django is not going to provide the translated strings for you. That is something that you, as a developer, as a team, as a translator, need to do, right? Django provides the framework for doing localization, right? But you need to provide the words, meaning you need a translator. So as I don't speak Chinese, I had to get my wife to do this because she's completely bilingual. So what I did is I would generate these files, I would send her the files, and she would pop in all the translations into Mandarin Chinese. And that's how we did it. If you're on a development team somewhere, you probably hire some sort of service to do this. There's plenty of translation services online. You You pay them money, you give them the files, they give you translations back. Or maybe someone on your team can do the translation for you. That'd be pretty cool. Don't have to pay somebody. So make sure that these are good and correct translations. You may need to provide some app context to explain some things. Also, there will be ignored translations. So anything that would be marked as fuzzy in comment is ignored when translation happens. If you have empty message string values, quote, quote, when Django renders your page, it's not going to translate that for you. It's not going to leave it blank. It'll leave it in the original language. And also, if you have any missing translations, let's say you marked a string for translation in your app, but it didn't appear in a language file. Again, Django basically does a no-op. It leaves it the way the string was. So for me, a good visual test case was when I would put in new translations, I would load up my application, flip it to simplified Chinese, and see if there was any English on the page anywhere. It stands out pretty good. So if I found any English phrase that was there, I'd know I missed a translation string. So once you put all of your message files in place, then you want to compile them. Python manage compile message. This converts PO files into MO files, and it's the MO files that Django actually uses. You want to treat these MO language files just like any other static asset. Your HTML files, your CSS, your JavaScript, your pings, your JPEGs, whatever. They basically become your static files. So you'll need to make sure that, let's say, when you deploy to Heroku, you put them in a static file directory that they can get uploaded. I think there's like a special, like depending on the platform you use, I think there's like a special like hidden directory name you can name for your language translations. So that's basically how we do translations in Django. Four-step process, pretty straightforward workflow, a little bit of configuration for settings and URLs. Then the bulk of the work is doing the marking all the strings for translation. And then finally, as just part of your development workflow, you compile the translations and you deploy them together with your app. So why do we do translations? Why would I spend so much extra effort adding Mandarin Chinese to my app, or Spanish or French or whatever language you want? The big picture here is that translation should bring people together, right? We live in a time where internet communication globally is instantaneous, right? I'm sitting here in North Carolina on the East Coast, broadcasting this talk. I know Calvin is in Indy. I know like all of y'all out there, you might be in the US, you might be in Europe, you might be in China. You could be anywhere in the world, but you're hearing and seeing this right now. Our world is more interconnected than ever before. Languages should not be a barrier to us being connected, right? We're Python community. It's awesome, right? So when we add languages to our applications, right? When we make it so that you can read it in English or French or Chinese or Spanish or Ukrainian or whatever, that helps bring people together. It makes people feel welcomed. It makes content accessible, right? We don't have to go through the struggle of learning an extra language just to fit in and belong and to understand. Much like how I opened this talk in Chinese, most of you are probably like, oh my gosh, what is he doing? Am I in the right talk, right? When you don't understand a language, it's inaccessible. Translations make content accessible. Furthermore, when it comes to translating your applications, as we've seen here, the process of internationalization is not necessarily difficult. It's just tedious, right? It's the kind of thing, okay, you put some settings in and then you just have to mark all your strings as you go. And so it's something that can be a real hassle to do retroactively to an application. So if you know from the start of a project that you're going to need to support multiple languages, multiple locales, I would say build that in from the start and just make that part of your regular development workflow so it feels normal and natural. Going back and trying to localize an app retroactively, that is very painful. At my previous company, they had to do that for a very large banking application, and it took months. So it's just a tedious grind work process. Another thing you might be wondering is, well, hey, Andy, why do I need explicit translations? Why, like I use Google Chrome, and when I visit a page in a different language, Google asks me to translate it for me just in time. Why can't we just use tools like that to, just translate on the fly? Why do I need an application, like a whole localization for my application? Well, the thing with those just-in-time just-in-time translators is that they're not always accurate, right? They can get, probably 90% of the words and phrases, but there's context that you want to communicate in order to be explicit, especially if you're trying to provide, instructions on something. And just-in-time translators don't always get it right, especially when the languages are very, very, very different. They've gotten better over time, but there are cases where you want to be explicit. And when you provide those translations ahead of time, it shows higher quality in your app. So that's why we would still want to do a process of make your translations, embed them in the app, and make it real. Interesting thing, AI might be able to help provide translations for message files in the future. Rather than have to go out and get a translator, maybe we could get AI as part of that to kind of figure out in context what these messages mean, how can they translate. Interesting thing, see where it goes. Also, finally, translators have an ethical duty to make correct, accurate translations. For somebody like me who doesn't read Chinese, if I'm presented a document written in Mandarin Chinese, I rely on a translator to translate that for me so I can read it. If that translator is pulling dirty tricks on me and changing words deliberately, that is unethical, and that's a problem. And I wouldn't be any the wiser, because I don't know, I would not be able to do that translation myself. So it's very, very important that we remember that as we develop these apps and we provide these translations. We have an ethical duty to do it right. And this hits home for me, because I said, like, part of my family is from China. If you have been watching world events the past couple of years, there's some not so good things happening in China these days. For example, we've all just been through COVID pandemic. We're still in COVID pandemic. In the early days, things were scary because we didn't know what was going on. We wanted to learn about what was happening with this virus, how to protect ourselves, and we wanted to avoid misinformation. The virus started in Wuhan, China, and then spread to the rest of the world. That's scientific fact. But in China, there was a massive misinformation campaign and propaganda campaign to kind of obscure that truth. So here is a screenshot of a news broadcast from CNN. It was broadcast in the United States. And this was, as you can see, breaking news. The CDC confirms first coronavirus case of unknown origin in the US. This was March of 2020. And that was when it was first starting to break out. In Chinese, in mainland China, that headline was translated to CDC of the USA admitted the first case of coronavirus originated in the US, meaning it came from the US. Completely different story. But most people in China, when they saw this, they wouldn't have known the English. They would have just taken the translation. We can also use translations for good. If you have heard, there is a genocide happening against Uyghur Muslims in China right now. New York Times translated a whole bunch of leaked government documents showing this is actually what's happening. There's no smoke and mirrors here. So as Pythonistas, we bear a moral responsibility to use all technology ethically, even translations. That's my talk, and I'm sticking to it. So thank you so much for listening. 谢谢. Be sure to hit me up on Twitter at Automation Panda afterwards. And if you want to talk about these things, let's chat.